Welcome back. Worldwide protests against the Israeli war on Gaza are reminiscent of massive demonstrations against other conflicts in the past. As recently as 2003, millions of anti-war demonstrators jammed into the streets of capitals across the world, voicing opposition to the US-led war in Iraq. Those protests had little effect, and President George Bush, along with his allies, invaded Iraq and toppled Saddam Hussein. Similarly, the march on October 7th, 2001 was one of a string of anti-war protests, followed by the US bombing of Afghanistan. Thousands of citizens turned out to oppose the Bush administration's so-called war on terrorism and to abandon military action in Afghanistan. Well, we're still joined by our guests in London, Osama Khashoggi, also in London, Jeremy Corbyn, and in New York, Joshua Moravchik. Jeremy Corbyn, I want to ask you about the role of propaganda, because we've seen both Israel and Hamas take their war into cyberspace, if you like. You've got the Israeli army showing images on YouTube of strikes against so-called terrorists to show that they're not targeting civilians. At the same time, you've got Hamas posting images on PalTube of civilian casualties. So who would you say right now has the upper hand in the battle for public opinion?
Well, there is a huge battle for public opinion going on through the airwaves. There's the reporting of television channels such as your own, which has maintained continuous coverage and included reporting direct from Gaza, which I think is unique amongst all the channels. Depressingly, a lot of the printed media have sort of downgraded the story to away from the front page to somewhere else. And some of the channels, mainly the US channels and to some extent the BBC, tend to report the whole issue as though it's a war between equals, with Israel under attack from an equally powerful partner. The reality is this is not a war of equals. This is a war of a very powerful state against a very impoverished population in Gaza. As to the other side of the argument, the access to internet and the access to YouTube and other kinds of video links means that a lot of people all around the world can directly communicate with each other and debate with each other in a way they never have before. And I suspect that one of the reasons there were so many demonstrations last weekend in pretty well every capital city of the world was because of the ability of people to see for themselves what's going on, and the power of television and print media to control information that people get is reducing all the time. I mean, I'm getting text messages from people in Gaza, tragically people whose homes have just been destroyed by Israeli bombing, but they are able to communicate directly about it. And the travesty of all this, the tragedy really, is that the whole world can watch on live television what is going on and can't feel they can't do anything about it.
Let me put one of the points you made to Joshua Moravchik. What do you make of Western media coverage of Israel's war on Gaza? Do you think that perhaps some elements of the media have portrayed this as essentially a war between two equal forces when, in fact, many would argue that it's asymmetric warfare?
I don't know. I don't read the British media with Mr. Corbyn. In the U.S. media, there's no question that this is a war between two unequal forces, and that Israel has much more firepower, but they're unequal in another sense as well. They are morally unequal because Israel wants to live in peace and let the people of Gaza live in peace. Hamas, as it says again and again, and as is stated in its charter, wants to destroy the state of Israel, drive the Jews into the sea. It is a genocidal movement. And so there is, on the one hand, the inequality of weapons and military might, and then on the other hand, there's the inequality of moral stature and of goals of the two sides.
Osama Khashoggi, what's your response to that?
I think you're absolutely, I don't know how you got the cheek to say this. I tell you, what you can't see and Israel can't see, that Israel are declaring a war against resistance. And that's what Israel will never understand, that resistance will never be defeated. It's not just Hamas who's fighting Israel in the Gaza Strip. It's the Al-Aqsa Brigade. It's all the Palestinian faction who's fighting, Israel now, and also the PLO. It is a resistance that you will never be able to defeat. And of course, the resistance in Gaza Strip.
Resistance to what?
The Israel power.
Resistance to
Israel.
what?
And there's no equal partners, of course. Resisting the Israeli occupation, which is acknowledged by the United Nations. And
but the occupation of where?
That you all violated.
Occupation of where? Which
the occupation of the Gaza
You're occupying Gaza and the West Bank.
The occupation of people's lives.
When people like you use the term resistance, certainly what people in Hamas mean is resistance to the existence of Israel. When you use the word occupation,
Joshua, I'm talking about
it means Israel itself.
Okay, I'm going to cut in there. Jeremy Corbyn, we've seen thousands gather in central London to demonstrate against the Gaza conflict. Has it had any impact on the British government's response to what is happening in Gaza?
I think what it's done is encouraged lots of members of Parliament to raise the issue of Gaza and of Palestine who maybe weren't going to raise it before. It also encouraged the British government into a position of supporting the UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire when the United States abstained, and that is quite unusual. What it's also done is encourage an awful lot of other people in the country to get involved and get active. And so whilst you might well see television images of the marches and demonstrations in London, in fact there have been demonstrations in virtually every major town and city in the whole of the UK. There is a massive outpouring of feeling on this, and there's going to now be a debate in Parliament on Thursday about Gaza because of the numbers of MPs that were demanding it yesterday. So it's having an effect, and I hope that the British government will be forced to go much further, and because since Israel is flouting international law and the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Council, it's time to take economic action and economic sanctions
against Israel. As you say, Jeremy, the British government hasn't gone much further. Osama Kashu, do you think there is a discrepancy between the way people feel and the actions of the government, or the lack of action?
Well, I think the government have to act, certainly in Europe and also in America. The anger of the Middle East is going to come to our streets sooner or later, and that's what people demonstrated in the street. And clearly the anger of the British public in the last two demonstrations we've made in London is totally clear, and it did create a little bit of conflict between communities in the British society, and that's basically putting a lot of pressure on the government that they have to make a stand and to do something against the war crimes that Israel is doing and slashing the international community. And I don't think the Europe governments can just ignore this anymore. They can't afford to ignore it, because it will be violent in the streets of London, and it will be violent in the streets of Europe sooner or later. But they did ignore it in the run-up to the Iraq war. Joshua Moravchik, we've seen these sort of protests before, but will it actually make any difference in the end to Israeli policy?
Well, of course, one can't say for sure what will happen, but one hopes not. In democracies, protests are interesting. They're a way for people to express opinions, but they must not be what determines policy. Policy is determined in a democratic system, in parliaments, and in reasoned debate, in newspapers, and it's not a contest of who can get more people into the street. So as Mr. Corbyn says, if you get a lot of people into the streets, it does attract the attention of parliamentarians. It may make them feel some pressure that their constituents want them. But at the end of the day, in democratic societies,
well, let me put that point to Jeremy Corbyn, that yes, these protests may get the attention of the politicians, but in the end it's going to have very little impact. It's going to make very little difference to policy.
I said it ought to make
measure it, but It's very hard to measure, but I do think it does make a difference because it changes the atmosphere of debate. It legitimizes the opposition, in this case, to what Israel is doing in Gaza. And in the long run, it does change policies. And so Tony Blair is no longer Prime Minister, largely because of Iraq and all the protests that were about his policies on Iraq. There wasn't an attack on Iran. I hope there never is an attack on Iran, largely because of protests and opposition around the world. And I honestly believe that the unprecedented outpouring of anger in support of Palestinian people over the past 2 weeks, during what is in Europe and North America a holiday period, has had a very big effect on legislators on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think that it will force the pace and force the change. Now, in Spain, the Prime Minister attended a demonstration. That's pretty unusual for a Prime Minister to attend a demonstration. That shows that he must be thinking, well, an awful lot of people in Spain are beginning to be very angry about this and want us to take some further action. And I think you will see over the next few days increasingly noises in parliaments and possibly even from governments about trade agreements with Israel, about the supply of arms to Israel, and about referring cases to the International Criminal Court for war crimes.
OK, well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us in London, Osama Kashu, Jeremy Corbyn, and in New York, Joshua Moravchik. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.